Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 363 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about Christianity and near-death experiences. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
In 1975, Raymond Moody brought near-death experiences to public attention with his best-selling book, Life After Life. But the press seldom gets stories like this right, and even many students of near-death experiences exaggerate or neglect aspects of NDEs. They may make it sound like everyone goes to heaven, or that people see whatever religious figures in the afterlife that they happen to believe in, or that NDEs teach reincarnation. All of this raised concerns among some Christians about whether near-death experiences were compatible with the faith. So, does everyone go to heaven? Do you see whatever God you worship? Do the experiences teach reincarnation, and are they compatible with the Christian faith? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, what do you want to say to begin today's mystery?
Today, we're going to be looking at the relationship between near-death experiences, or NDEs, and the Christian faith. This means that today's episode is going to involve a fusion of the faith and reason perspectives. Normally, we consider those separately in each episode, such as looking at a subject from the reason perspective and then looking at it from the faith perspective. But this time, we're looking at the intersection of the two. Near-death experiences are normally studied from the reason perspective since they're studied by science. And of course, the Christian faith is something that deals with the faith perspective. Consequently, we're not going to be pulling the two perspectives apart today. We're going to be looking at their intersection. The faith and reason perspectives will be woven together in this episode.
What does that mean in practical terms?
Well, one of the things it means is that we won't have distinct segments on the faith and reason perspectives. It also means that I'm going to be speaking more from the faith perspective than I normally do when I'm doing parapsychology. As we covered in episode 360, parapsychology is a branch of science that studies psychic functioning and the survival of bodily death. Near-death experiences are thus right up parapsychology's alley. But the key thing is that parapsychology is a science. So, like other people of faith who are involved in science, I wear more than one hat. I have my faith hat on when I'm thinking about things as a person of faith, and I have my science hat on when I'm thinking about parapsychology considered as a science. There's a difference between what I may personally believe as a matter of faith and what I can show to be the case using reason alone from a scientific perspective. So there's some role switching that goes on. And that's not just true of me in parapsychology. It's true of any person of faith and any of the scientific disciplines. The same kind of role switching goes on if a person is Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, or anything else. And the same kind of role switching goes on whether the person is involved with physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, or parapsychology. There's one role that the person is functioning in when they're doing the science itself, and there's another role that the person is functioning in when they're assimilating the findings of science from the faith perspective. Well, today I'm not doing pure parapsychology. We will be covering the findings of parapsychology when it comes to near-death experiences, but in today's episode, we're actually in assimilation mode and asking how the Christian faith would regard them. So I won't be proceeding strictly from the scientifically neutral perspective I would be if I were doing research on the phenomenon or teaching a parapsychology class on them. The point of today's episode is figuring out what a Christian would make of NDEs. What we're doing today is not a scientific analysis of NDEs, but a look at them from the point of view of the Christian faith, and that requires me to speak significantly from the faith perspective.
And why did you want to do today's mystery?
Well, we periodically talk about near-death experiences and related phenomena on the show, and people in the audience have heard some of the common ideas about them, like the ones you mentioned in our intro, and they've asked about what to make of these experiences from a Christian point of view. We've thus discussed questions on the show briefly before, usually in the faith perspective segments. We even took on the idea that everyone goes to heaven in episode 292 on disturbing near-death experiences. You can go to mysterious.fm/292 to listen to that. But it turns out that at least 20% of NDEs turn out to have negative elements in them, and some of them are positively hellish. So the idea that they're all joyous and heavenly is just mistaken. But as we heard some NDE researchers admit in that episode, various people in the NDE community didn't want to hear about the negative experiences. They preferred, understandably, support in the more comfortable narrative that NDEs were always positive. And it took some people who had negative experiences, like author Nancy Evans Bush, to stand up and get the attention of the NDE community by saying, no, I had a negative experience. Don't sweep these under the rug. Well, just like the idea all NDEs were positive was a comfortable narrative, so were other ideas, like you see whatever God you worship in an NDE, so they're religiously neutral, and that they teach reincarnation, so they're comfortable for reincarnation supporters. But there was still the question of how well-grounded these claims were in the actual data. Were they just comfortable anecdotal impressions that some people had, or were they actually backed up by statistics?
How can you explain these claims?
Well, I pointed out that all NDEs are quite brief, and they are subject to misremembering and misinterpretation. Everybody who's had an NDE only stayed in the apparent afterlife for a very brief time, so they didn't get that far in, and they might be interpreting what they see based on their previous beliefs. They might simply never have gotten to the stage where their previous beliefs would be corrected. Furthermore, there's the issue of how much they actually remember of the experience, because you might not remember and be able to correctly express everything about your experience, and many NDEers report that they can't do it justice in words. They also report that they often can't remember things that they knew in the afterlife, so it could be that they've forgotten aspects of the experience in the trauma of coming back to life. After all, the majority of people who experience clinical death don't even remember having an NDE. It's actually only about 15% of people who do. So there could be a whole lot of forgetting going on. And then the person needs to interpret what they do remember once they're alive again. And it would be natural to interpret the pieces of what you do remember in light of what you've always believed. And then there's the problem of hoaxes, because people commit hoaxes for various purposes in every area of life, including this one. In fact, we'll have a future episode about NDE hoaxes that have been done. Hoaxes are one reason I'm immediately suspicious of books that are based on a single experience that one person had, because NDEs tend to be brief, and if you can base a whole book on a single person's experience, then that NDE is at a minimum an extreme outlier that isn't representative of what happens in most NDEs. And the book may well involve exaggeration of the experience or an outright hoax. A while ago, I came across a historical account of an NDE that I think falls into this category, and I think it's really amusing. It's found in Gregory Shushan's book, Near-Death Experiences in Indigenous Religions. This one was reported in the mid-1600s when French missionaries were evangelizing the Wyandot and Huron people here in North America. Shushan writes,
"A partly distressing NDE led to perhaps the earliest indigenous religious revitalization movement, when a converted Wyandot woman rose from her burial in a Christian cemetery and told of her experiences in the heaven of the French, a realm of fire, where Christians burned souls in order to possess them. She was greeted with firebrands and burning torches, with cruelties and torments inconceivable. Though she was dead only one day, it seemed like years. She was finally assisted by a certain person moved with compassion for her, who released her from her chains and showed her a valley that led to the afterlife realm of indigenous people who had not converted to Christianity, a place of delights and goodness without evil. She could see the realm's villages and fields and hear people dancing and feasting. Though because she wanted to warn her people of the dangers of converting to Christianity, she decided to return into her body. The news of her experience soon spread everywhere and became an article of faith among indigenous people. Additional new beliefs also stemmed from the experience, such as that the sky is a fiery realm since it is closer to the sun. The beliefs were still current 11 years later, as reported by Jean Akin, who complained that missionaries were often being accused of luring native souls to heaven in order to burn them.
To be honest, I find this NDE account really amusing. The idea that there's one heaven for the French and another for Native Americans is quaint, but what's really funny is the idea that the French missionaries are trying to get you to convert to Christianity so that they can take your soul to French heaven and burn it and torture it. Because I happen to know something about French missionaries, and I'm pretty sure that was not their goal. If this NDE report is accurate, then at a minimum, this has to be a severely misremembered or misunderstood one, an extreme outlier, or possibly even a hoax. But you see how some NDE accounts can be shaped by a religious agenda, so we need to be suspicious of outlier experiences and instead focus on what's reported in normal mainstream NDEs. Well, I found a resource that does just that, and specifically asks the question of how common these alternative narratives are in NDEs. It's by the evangelical author J. Steve Miller, and it's titled, Is Christianity Compatible with Deathbed and Near-Death Experiences?
And why did he write the book?
Because there's been considerable suspicion in evangelical circles about NDEs, with some major figures, like Pastor John MacArthur, for example, arguing against them having any legitimacy. I remember back in the 1990s, an evangelical apologist I knew named Richard Ibanez wrote a couple of books on NDEs, and he was very skeptical of them. Well, Miller wanted to respond to these viewpoints in the evangelical community, and he proposes that one reason for these negative viewpoints is that some of the evangelical authors were focused on single experience books, which, as I mentioned earlier, we have some reason to be suspicious to. And some of these books were later exposed as hoaxes, or at least as highly suspect. So that kind of poisoned the well, and many didn't really look into the scholarly research that has been done on NDEs. I think part of the reason also is that evangelical skeptics are dependent heavily on their own understanding of theology, and this causes them some problems. For example, many of them are hard Christian exclusivists, meaning that they believe that unless you have conscious faith in Jesus Christ, and often an evangelical version of conscious faith in Christ, then you're automatically going to hell. That's not what the data on NDEs suggest. And Catholics don't have a problem with that because we're not hard exclusivists, and we recognize that God only holds people accountable for what they know. So if a person isn't Christian through no fault of their own, but otherwise cooperates with God's grace, then they can still go to heaven. But for people like John MacArthur, that view is a no-go. And you could see how someone coming from that perspective might conclude that NDEs can't be real, that they're either naturally explainable in terms of the dying brain, or there's some kind of demonic deception because it's always demons. Also, there are idiosyncratic Bible interpretations in some part of the evangelical world that could also cause problems here. For example, in 2 Corinthians 5, St. Paul is talking about life and death, and he says,
So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please Him.
Well, because many evangelicals have not historically been fans of purgatory, although that is changing somewhat, this passage has been used as a proof text against purgatory. The way that works is that they take Paul's statement that he would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord, and they turn it into a kind of definition. So you'll hear people say that to be away from the body is to be at home with the Lord. That's not really a good argument against purgatory, because God can still purify you in the twinkling of an eye so that your purgatory might be instantaneous. But that doesn't stop various evangelicals from saying to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, as if it disproved purgatory. In fact, some say it so often that they misremember and misquote St. Paul. What he actually says is that he'd rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord, not that the two were the same thing or that the transition from one to the other was instantaneous. I mean, I might say, I'd rather be away from the office and at home with my family, without implying that being away from the office is the same thing as being at home with my family, or that the instant I step out of the office, I instantly teleport to my home. But with some regularity, you'll hear evangelicals misquoting this verse from memory. In any event, that understanding also didn't fit well with the data reported in NDE experiences, which involve a non-instantaneous process. And in general, the data from NDEs could be viewed suspiciously from a certain Protestant perspective, since one of the major principles of Protestantism is sola scriptura, the idea that we should get all our doctrine from Scripture alone. And while the data about NDEs wouldn't be a matter of Christian doctrine, you can still see how the proposition of entertaining ideas about the afterlife coming from outside of Scripture would be uncomfortable for some.
But does that mean all Protestants or all evangelical Protestants are hostile to NDEs?
Oh, no, by no means. For example, there have been a variety of evangelical apologists who have no problem with them at all and use them in their work. For example, there's Gary Habermas and J.P. Moreland, both of whom are excellent Christian apologists in the evangelical community. They have taken near-death experiences seriously and use them in their apologetics work, arguing for the existence of the afterlife. Now, J. Steve Miller has also directly taken on the question of whether Christianity is compatible with them to answer a lot of concerns raised by evangelicals who are skeptical. And incidentally, Gary Habermas wrote the introduction to Miller's book.
Let's look at what Miller discovered. What should we say to set the stage?
The first thing to note is that his book covered both deathbed visions, or DBVs, and near-death experiences, or NDEs. We discussed deathbed visions in episode 318, so you can go to mysterious.fm/318 for that. And we discussed near-death experiences way back in episode 27, which is at mysterious.fm/27. We'll also be discussing NDEs more in future episodes because I know way more about them now than I did 7 years ago. A second thing to note is that Miller remarks on how many questions these phenomena don't answer about the afterlife or about religion or the Christian faith in general. He writes,
NDEers who report long lessons on theology are so rare as to be anomalous. It's not a part of the core experience. While many experiencers are probably eager to clear up common theological issues, mode of baptism, charismatic versus non-charismatic, Protestant versus Catholic, etc., these are simply not discussed in the thousands of NDEs/DBEs that I've read, as reported in serious studies. It's as if there's some gag order from the other side to the angels and deceased relatives. Don't get into theological discussions.
And that actually has a bit of an echo in Jesus' parable of Lazarus and the rich man in Luke 16, where Abraham tells the rich man that he's not going to send Lazarus back to talk to the rich man's brothers because, he says, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. It's like God has already made provisions for the living to learn about him, so don't expect people who come back from the afterlife, like NDEers, to settle all our theological debates.
That's not to say that near-death experiences don't reveal anything about the afterlife, though, right?
No, they may not settle specific theological issues, but they do reveal general things that are either compatible or incompatible with particular religious worldviews. In fact, Miller has a whole chapter on how NDE data contradicts various religious worldviews. We won't go through the chapter, but to cite just a few examples, near-death experiences obviously contradict worldviews that say there's no afterlife, like in Sadducee Judaism. They also contradict the Christian mortalism worldview, which holds that we have no conscious experiences until the resurrection. This view is held by groups like the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses. And NDEs contradict various religions that hold that one reincarnates either at the moment of death or quite shortly thereafter, like many in Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, since people are greeted in NDEs by deceased relatives who died years and years ago. And these things happen regardless of what the person having the NDE believed in life. Materialists who think there is no afterlife still have NDEs, so do Christian mortalists like Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses. Buddhists who think you reincarnate quickly still get greeted by long-dead loved ones, and Miller also includes this particularly touching story about a Jehovah's Witness.
Natalia, one of my students, reported seeing her uncle on his deathbed. He was a staunch Jehovah's Witness, a high-ranking overseer who didn't believe in meeting others on the other side at death. Yet, in a deathbed vision, totally against his expectations, he began talking to his deceased father and was overjoyed to see his daughter, who had died before she was born. He kept saying, "She's so beautiful." Her relatives chalked it up to morphine, but Natalia felt it was real. Whatever we make of this particular case, researchers have concluded that the core elements of deathbed visions and NDEs occur regardless of expectations or prior beliefs.
So there are things that one could conclude about the afterlife based on data from NDEs. It's not a question of people reporting whatever it was that they believed before they had their NDE, which is going to be very significant in our discussion today.
In the quotation we just read, Miller referred to the core elements of deathbed visions and NDEs not being influenced by prior beliefs. Those core elements would be the most commonly reported ones. Does that mean that Miller is skeptical of outlier experiences that make uncommon claims, like you are?
Yes, in fact, he says,
elements that occur infrequently, that are not considered part of the core experience, should be regarded with more skepticism. After all, in a medical crisis, a person might have both a legitimate NDE, or a deathbed experience, and a vivid hallucination, failing to distinguish the two. Some may skew a report to agree with their worldview or religion. Others may spice up a story to seek more book sales. Still others may have mental illness. Thus, reports of memories from past lives, novel doctrine, etc., should especially be looked upon with a skeptical eye, since they seem anomalous to the typical experience.
So the evidentially safe thing to do is look at what lots of people report, not just what only a few people report, because individual reports could be erroneous due to a bunch of factors, but those factors are less likely to apply to the bulk of the reports. Just like in other areas of science, more confidence is placed on typical test results rather than on outlier readings that are more likely to be wrong. So today, we'll be focusing on what NDEers typically report.
All right, so before we get to those, let's take a moment now to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including John L., Paul L., Robert K., Scott P., and Catherine L. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by Conceiving Crime, a gripping new true crime podcast uncovering the darkest secrets the abortion, sex, and fertility industries hope you never hear. These industries operate in the shadows, where human life is treated as a product, mistakes are covered up, and crimes go unpunished. From professional surrogacy scammers to families torn apart by IVF, Conceiving Crime exposes the stories no one else will tell. What happens when life itself becomes a business? Find out at conceivingcrime.com or wherever you get your podcasts. So, Jimmy, how do you want to proceed in looking at the mystery now?
I want to look at some of the key objections to near-death experiences from a Christian perspective. We've already looked at some of the Protestant-specific issues, like whether they violate the Protestant principle of sola scriptura, but Catholics don't use that principle, and even evangelicals like Habermas, Moreland, and Miller don't see a problem here. What we'll do next is look at some more general issues that would be the kind of things that any Christian, regardless of type, might wonder about. For example, first, do the basic elements of NDEs correspond to Christian expectations about the afterlife, and how might we explain any differences in expectation? Second, there's the issue of the positive experiences that many NDEs report and whether this poses a problem for Christians. Third, there's the issue of whether NDEs suggest anything that classical Christianity would regard as a false doctrine, like do they teach that people reincarnate, for example. Fourth, what do NDEs suggest about Jesus and other figures from world religions like Buddha and Muhammad? And fifth, even if NDEs don't suggest anything that would be considered false doctrine from a Christian perspective, do they weaken people's faith, like encouraging them to become spiritual rather than religious, or stop going to church, or things like that?
Then let's proceed to analyze those issues. Before we do that, though, what do you make of the claims made by some that near-death experiences are illusions caused by demons?
Well, this may come as a surprise to some, but some NDEers actually report encountering evil entities like demons. We discussed that back in episode 292 on disturbing near-death experiences. For example, Nancy Evans Bush, who helped promote awareness of disturbing NDEs, had such an experience herself. As we covered then, she reported that in her near-death experience, she went sailing through a dark void, and while that was happening, she was confronted by a series of circular shapes that looked like what she later learned were yin-yang symbols. They changed colors, flashing between black and white, and that flashing communicated to her that everything she had ever believed was a lie. Her whole life was a lie. No one she ever knew or loved was real. It was all a sick joke. Well, one way of looking at that experience would be to say that the circles she encountered were evil spiritual beings or demons, and they were tormenting her by lying to her about her whole life being an illusion and a game. Others who have had disturbing NDEs have reported demons appearing in more conventional demonic forms also. So I don't dismiss at all the possibility that some NDEs, particularly the disturbing ones, may involve demons. God may allow some people to have disturbing NDEs or DNDEs in order to give them a wake-up call that they need to make some changes, and he may allow demons to interact with them as part of that wake-up call.
But what about other NDEs, the ones that aren't disturbing and don't seem to involve evil spiritual entities or demons?
Well, speaking from the faith perspective, I can't rule out that regular NDEs aren't also demonic. It's not like that's intrinsically impossible. It doesn't involve a logical contradiction or anything. But it's certainly not how they appear. Unlike Nancy Evans Bush's experience, normal NDEs don't present themselves as involving evil spiritual entities. In fact, they seem to do the opposite, with many NDEers reporting that they met God and Jesus and felt intense love. A basic principle of rationality is a position known in philosophy as phenomenal conservatism, and it holds that experiences should be taken as they appear, as they present themselves, until you get evidence that indicates you should interpret the experience in another way. For example, if you come home and have a conversation with your spouse, you could interpret this as really being your spouse, or you could interpret it as your spouse's evil twin who's trying to trick you, even though you've never had any evidence that such a twin exists. But interpreting the experience in the latter way would be irrational. In the same way, if you clinically die and then seem to meet God, you should interpret that as meaning that, well, you clinically died and then met God, not that you met a demon who was trying to trick you into thinking it was God. That's not to say a demon can't impersonate God. As St. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11:14, Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. But you need evidence if you want to propose that a particular angel is really the devil. And you need evidence if you want to propose that when you seem to meet God, it's really a demon trying to trick you. There's also a conceptual difficulty of why would God allow the devil to impersonate him for basically everyone who has an NDE? Because I find it a little hard to imagine that a good God, the biblical God, would let everyone who has an NDE and comes back with memories of talking to God or Jesus was actually being tricked by the devil, and nobody ever got to talk with God or Jesus when they died. I find it hard to imagine that a good God would allow that to happen, so I'd need significant evidence to show that the general explanation for NDEs is demonic trickery.
What kind of evidence would show that?
Well, basically, if near-death experiences involve the kinds of things that demons are known to do, like possessing people, except that doesn't happen with NDEs, so we have to look for other known demonic behaviors. Another known demonic behavior is torturing people, like when they physically and mentally torment people in the Bible. People in an NDE don't have their bodies with them, but like Nancy Evans Bush, some do report being mentally tortured. That would fit with her experiences, but it wouldn't explain NDEs that aren't disturbing. So again, we'd have to look elsewhere. A third known type of demonic behavior is impersonating non-Christian deities in order to get worship away from the true God. So we'll want to consider any non-Christian religious figures that appear in NDEs. And a fourth known demonic behavior is trying to woo people away from the faith in terms of belief or practice. So we'll be looking at whether NDEs involve things like false doctrine and whether they do things like discourage people from living Christian lives, like if they stop going to church, for example.
Then let's dig into the issues that you laid out. The first one was whether the basic elements of NDEs correspond to Christian expectations about the afterlife. What should we know on this topic?
This is something that Miller devotes a considerable amount of space to in his book. It's the main subject of Chapter 2, and he lists 47 aspects of NDEs that he believes correspond to Christian expectations about the afterlife, which he also backs up with Bible verses. What he typically does is state a proposition that is based on what NDEers report. Then he may make a comment or two. He'll have a quotation from an NDE experiencer or an NDE researcher, and then he'll quote a Bible verse or several Bible verses that endorse the same concept. Here's an example of that, which is Miller's sixth correspondence between NDE reports and biblical expectations.
6. God is just. It's instructive that nobody I read of comes back to life saying, "I got so infuriated at God. He was so wrong in his evaluations of things." Rather, they uniformly seem convinced that he is right in his ways. An NDEer reported, "It was clear to me why I'd had cancer, why I had come into this world in the first place, what role each of my family members played in my life, where we all were within the grand scheme of things, and in general what life is all about." This reminds me of C.S. Lewis's statement that one of his first exclamations upon meeting God in heaven would be, "Of course," because in heaven he'd understand the answers to all the questions he had on earth.
Then Miller quotes the Bible to show how Christian expectations correspond to this.
All his ways are just. Daniel chapter 4, verse 37, and Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4.
So, yeah, the Bible says that God is just, and NDEers come back agreeing that God is just, even about things they might be mad about in this life, like getting cancer. They don't come back and say how unjust and unfair God is. Instead, they see a bigger picture and realize God is actually just. Now, I don't agree with Miller about absolutely all of what he says in this chapter. For example, his 28th correspondence is this.
28. We will have spiritual bodies, which are different from and superior to our physical bodies. So, to adopt a term for it, the new form in which they find themselves, which will sum up its properties fairly well, I shall henceforth call it the spiritual body. Raymond Moody.
He then backs this up by quoting from St. Paul when he says,
"It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body." 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 44.
I don't have any problem with NDEers perceiving themselves as having a kind of spiritual body when they're outside of their physical one. We're built to perceive things in terms of our normal experiences and to interpret things in terms of our normal experiences. So I don't have a problem with the perception of having a spiritual body, but I disagree with Miller's citation from 1 Corinthians, because what St. Paul is talking about is not the intermediate state between death and resurrection. He's talking about what our bodies will be like when we are raised from the dead. you'll note that he says it is raised a spiritual body, and scholars generally conclude that Paul means that it will be a supernaturalized body, one empowered by the Holy Spirit, not an intangible, ghostly body that is made out of spirit. But the thing is that Paul is talking about our resurrected bodies, not the form we will have in the intermediate state between death and resurrection. So he's simply not talking about what an NDEer would experience, and I think this is a misfire on Miller's part. I would have supported the perception of a spiritual body by appealing to a different passage in St. Paul than Miller does. In 2 Corinthians 12, verses 2 and 3, St. Paul says that 14 years ago he was caught up to the third heaven, but he doesn't know if he was caught up in his body or without his body. The fact that he couldn't tell if he was in his body or not means that if he was outside of his body, he still perceived himself as having a body. So it is consistent with the Christian faith to hold that those outside of their bodies can perceive themselves as still having one. I thus would rephrase this point in terms of perception and support it differently from the Bible, but I think that it still corresponds to what can be a reasonable Christian expectation. And Miller is right that there are an impressive number of correspondences between what NDEers report and what Christians would expect concerning the afterlife. So even though it'll take a few moments to go through them all, here's the complete list of 47 correspondences that Miller proposes.
1. God exists. 2. God is love. 3. God knows us intimately. 4. God is personal. 5. God is described as extremely desirable, beautiful, and winsome. 6. God is just. 7. God is associated with light. 8. God and Jesus comfort people in their most distressing times. 9. God especially pays attention to children and the least of these. 10. God sometimes teaches us through children. 11. Sometimes people die and are resuscitated or come close to death at a time prior to their final death. At that time, their spirit leaves their bodies and returns. 12. Sometimes God communicates in vivid dreams. 13. Sometimes God communicates in visions. 14. There's more to the other side than paradise, hell, heaven, the throne room of God. A spiritual world of angels and demons exists seemingly alongside our physical world, sometimes remaining hidden and sometimes interacting with the world. 15. Sometimes people experience the other side while present and aware of this side. 16. Sometimes people nearby share part of the experience. 17. Sometimes people experience the other side while being consciously absent from their bodies. 18. Sometimes angels accompany people to heaven. 19. Sometimes angels communicate with people, both the living and the dying. 20. Sometimes the deceased see and or communicate with the living, some deceased recently, some deceased long ago. 21. Some healthy people know ahead of time when they will die. 22. Many see Jesus. 23. Death isn't the end of life. 24. Extraordinary beauty awaits us on the other side. 25. Heaven and or its entryway vestibule is varied and often beyond imagination or communication in precise earthly language. 26. For the blessed, there will be no pain in heaven. 27. Time is different over there. 28. We will have spiritual bodies, which are different from and superior to our physical bodies. 29. The mind can exist apart from the body. 30. We know and understand things much more clearly on the other side. 31. There are intermediaries between God and people. 32. The other side isn't rosy for everyone. 33. Heaven is a place you want to go. 34. Your life has meaning, one or more purposes. 35. Your life choices matter to God. Both good deeds and bad deeds, sins, are remembered by Him. 36. Material things are temporary and not worth obsessing over. 37. A huge part of why we're here is to love people. 38. Go about doing good. Love is more than a feeling. Act with love toward people. 39. It's important to love God. 40. Prioritize those closest to you, family and neighbors. 41. Seeking knowledge is very important. 42. Requests, desires, and prayers seem to be taken into account. 43. Don't lust for power and possessions. 44. Be a decent person. Forgive. Tell the truth. Don't be aggressive. Give to charities. 45. Don't be consumed with cultural norms. 46. Appreciate ordinary things. 47. Connect with God through spiritual disciplines such as church attendance, Bible reading, and prayer.
I'd phrase a few things differently or quibble here and there, but that's an impressive number of similarities between what NDEs report and what Christians expect. And so we need to add all this material to the fact that it's hard to imagine a good God letting people who are clinically dead being systematically tricked by demons.
We thus have a good bit of evidence that will need to be overcome if you want to sustain a demonic interpretation of NDEs. But not every detail that's reported in near-death experiences is something that Christians are expecting. Is there a way to explain the differences?
I think there are several ways to explain them. In the first place, some NDE accounts may be erroneous for a whole bunch of reasons. Some may be hoaxes, some may be misremembered, some may even be demonic tricks. That's why we're focused on the core experiences regarding NDEs rather than the outliers. In the second place, well, God hadn't told us everything. God's mystery is infinite, so no matter how much He reveals, there's always more that could have been told. Thus, Scripture and tradition give us only partial accounts of what is undoubtedly simplified. Things that NDEs report that aren't mentioned explicitly in Scripture and tradition may simply be things that God hadn't divinely revealed, so they're not part of the faith that we're bound to believe. Instead, they're like other things that God lets us discover for ourselves, but they're not binding in matters of faith. I thus don't think that things in NDEs that are unexpected, like the perception of passing through a tunnel, is a good test for things being demonic. Third, our minds are presently set up to function in this life. As a result, there's a lot about the next world that we're not capable of imagining. That's why Scripture uses symbolism when it's talking about the afterlife in heaven, like when we get glimpses of heaven in the book of Revelation. We also know that even in the Bible, God uses the background of the human author in shaping the revelation that comes through him. That's true of authors like Paul and James in the New Testament, who sound quite different from each other. It's also true with prophets, like how Isaiah and Daniel have prophecies that feel different and use different types of symbolism. So since the afterlife exceeds our present ability to imagine, and since God uses the background of individuals in helping them understand transcendent matters, it's no surprise if He does the same thing with NDE experiencers. That is, He uses symbolism based on an individual's personal background to help them understand what they're experiencing in the afterlife. I thus don't think that, this sounds different than what I expect, is a good test for NDEs being demonic, any more than I think this biblical author sounds a little different than this other biblical author is a good test that one passage or the other must be demonic. What we really need is not material that is unexpected or different, but material that actually contradicts the Christian faith if you want to propose demons as a general explanation. And given the positive evidence we've already covered, we'd need quite a bit of such material that is part of the core of the NDE experience rather than just outlier data that doesn't represent NDEs in general.
Then let's look at the positive experiences of the afterlife that many NDEers report, According to some popular accounts, everyone who had an NDE reports that it was positive. Wouldn't that pose a problem for the Christian faith?
Well, it would if NDEs were representative of what happens to everyone upon their final death, at least unless hopeful universalists like Hans Urs von Balthasar are correct, and God finds a way to lead everyone to him by the end of life so that no one dies in mortal sin. However, assuming that von Balthasar is wrong about that, and some people do die in mortal sin, it still would not contradict the Christian faith, even if everybody who had an NDE came back reporting that it was positive, because it might turn out that only saved people get to come back. Maybe everyone who dies in mortal sin goes straight to hell and isn't allowed to come back. Maybe coming back from clinical death is a favor that only those in a state of grace receive. You could conjecture that experiences in NDEs are representative of what happens to people who, in general, upon their final death, but we don't know that. So you can't infer anything about what proportion of people go to heaven or hell from NDE accounts. But then there's the fact that, as we covered back in episode 292 on distress in NDEs, that popular accounts of all NDEs being pleasant are just wrong. At least 20% of them, maybe more, contain distressing elements, and some of them are positively hellish. There is thus no incompatibility between what we learn from NDEs and the idea that hell is real and that some people go there.
What about people who attempt suicide? Sometimes they reported to have positive experiences in NDEs. Does that pose a problem for us?
Suicide is a grave sin, and as early as Raymond Moody's 1975 book, Life After Life, which introduced NDEs to the public, he noted a correlation between suicide and negative experiences during NDEs. He wrote,
I do know of a few cases in which a suicide attempt was the cause of the apparent death. These experiences were uniformly characterized as being unpleasant. As one woman said, if you leave here a tormented soul, you will be a tormented soul over there too. In short, they report that the conflicts they had attempted suicide to escape were still present when they died, but with added complications. In their disembodied state, they were unable to do anything about their problems, and they also had to view the unfortunate consequences which resulted from their acts. A man who was despondent about the death of his wife shot himself, died as a result, and was resuscitated. He states, I didn't go where my wife was. I went to an awful place. I immediately saw the mistake I had made. I thought, I wish I hadn't done it. Others who experienced this unpleasant limbo state have remarked that they had the feeling they would be there for a long time. This was their penalty for breaking the rules, by trying to release themselves prematurely from what was, in effect, an assignment to fulfill a certain purpose in life. Such remarks coincide with what has been reported to me by several people who died of other causes, but who said that, while they were in this state, it had been intimated to them that suicide was a very unfortunate act, which attended with a severe penalty. One man who had a near-death experience after an accident said, While I was over there, I got the feeling that two things it was completely forbidden for me to do would be to kill myself or to kill another person. If I were to commit suicide, I would be throwing God's gift back in his face. Killing somebody else would be interfering with God's purpose for that individual. Sentiments like these, which by now have been expressed to me in many separate accounts, are identical to those embodied in the most ancient theological and moral arguments against suicide, one which occurs in various forms in the writings of thinkers as diverse as St. Thomas Aquinas, Locke, and Kant. A suicide, in Kant's view, is acting in opposition to the purposes of God, and arrives on the other side viewed as a rebel against his Creator. Aquinas argues that life is a gift from God, and that it is God's prerogative, not man's, to take it back. In discussing this, however, I do not pass a moral judgment against suicide. I only report what others who have been through this experience have told me.
Since 1975, when Moody's book first came out, we've now gathered thousands of NDE reports, and some people who have attempted suicide do report positive experiences in the afterlife. But this is not unexpected, at least from a Catholic perspective and from the perspective of many Protestants too, since a person who attempts suicide may be in such a mental state that they are not fully responsible for their actions. From the Catholic perspective, the Catechism of the Catholic Church states,
grave psychological disturbances, anguish, or grave fear of hardship, suffering, or torture can diminish the responsibility of the one committing suicide. We should not despair of the eternal salvation of persons who have taken their own lives. By ways known to Him alone, God can provide the opportunity for salutary repentance. The Church prays for persons who have taken their own lives.
I'd also note that those who have attempted suicide and then have an NDE have a remarkably lower rate of attempted suicide again when compared to those who attempt suicide but then don't have an NDE. It's like the NDE, whether positive or negative, helps instill the value of human life and an anti-suicide ethic in those who have NDEs. NDE researcher Bruce Grayson has a paper on this that we'll link to. So, as always, suicide is not the answer, and help is available for those who are tempted in this direction. Here in the United States, they can phone 988 anytime, day or night, to get help, and other countries have their own hotlines.
Okay, that deals with the issue of suicide, but what about reports of positive experiences in the afterlife for those who are not believers in Jesus Christ, who aren't Christians?
Christians have different views on the afterlife and who will get to go to heaven. Some Christians are what you can refer to as hard exclusivists, and they hold that those who get into heaven are exclusively those who have conscious faith in Jesus Christ during their lifetimes. On this view, if you don't believe in Jesus, you're toast. But that position, at least in its strictest form, is not broadly held in the Christian community because it would result in some manifestly unfair cases. For example, what about the salvation of small children who aren't able to make a personal act of faith in Jesus? Or what about those who are mentally handicapped so that they can't make an act of personal faith? Are all such people, including innocent little babies, just damned? Well, most Christians have concluded that God has special provisions for people in situations like that, people who, through no fault of their own, aren't able to have faith. And so most Christians are not strict, hard exclusivists. But if you allow people into heaven who didn't have faith through no fault of their own, how far do you go with that? Some exclusivists might try to draw a line and say that, well, once a person reaches a certain age of mental development, commonly called the age of accountability, then they become responsible for not knowing the truth about God, and then they'll go to hell if they don't make an act of personal faith. But that only raises the question of what about people who have never heard the gospel? I mean, aren't they innocently ignorant of it, like the Jews who were believers in God but not in Jesus before the time of Christ, or Jews who were living in the time of Christ but in areas so remote from Judea that the news of Christ never reached them during their lives? And what about virtuous non-Jews who had never heard about Jesus? Here, Christian thought has gone back and forth. In the early centuries, various church fathers held that virtuous pagans could be saved. Some pagans had even reasoned their way to realize that God existed, and they tried to live according to reason, according to logos in Greek. And since Jesus is the logos, as John's gospel tells us, they were implicitly living according to Jesus and so could be saved. But then Europe was thoroughly evangelized, and so everyone in Europe was either a Christian, a Jew, or a Muslim. So everybody knew about Jesus, and in the European imagination, it was easy to think that everybody had heard about Jesus, so if you weren't a believer in Jesus, it must be your fault. And theology assumed a more exclusivist form. But then the age of exploration happened. The Americas and Australia were discovered, and it was suddenly obvious that there were millions of people who had never heard about Jesus through no fault of their own, and so theologians began retrieving the earlier thought of the church fathers about how virtuous pagans might be able to be saved. In his book, Miller, who is a Protestant, touches on a few of these points, but he doesn't end up drawing a firm conclusion about them. He just raises some points and leaves the specific resolution to the reader. However, today the Catholic Church teaches that it is possible for a person who is not Christian in this life to be saved, as long as they are innocently unaware of the truth of the gospel. Knowing it's true is not the same thing as having heard it, and they otherwise live up to the degree of light and grace that they have received, however much or little that may be. Thus, the Catechism of the Catholic Church states,
prayer is lived in the first place beginning with the realities of creation. Noah's offering is pleasing to God, who blesses him and through him all creation, because his heart was upright and undivided. Noah, like Enoch before him, walks with God. This kind of prayer is lived by many righteous people in all religions.
So prayer that is pleasing to God is lived by many righteous people in all religions, which means that all religions contain some righteous people. Consequently, the fact that many deathbed visions and near-death experiences are pleasant and happen to people who aren't Christian should not be regarded as a sign that the experiences are false. There are people who are not Christian in this life who will be saved through Jesus Christ and who will have a positive afterlife, even if they have to wait until the afterlife to discover that it was Jesus who provided their salvation.
Then let's turn to the next issue you identified. Do we find that NDEs suggest anything that classical Christianity would regard as a false doctrine? For example, the Bible says that when we die, we will be judged by God, and many NDEs report that they do experience what's called a life review, in which they see the things they did in life, whether good or bad, and they're evaluated from a moral perspective. But some NDEs say that it wasn't God judging them, but that they judged themselves. Wouldn't that be a false doctrine?
To solve this one, let's start with what NDEs actually report. The reports of the life review actually come in several different forms. Many report that they encounter a being of light that they just know is God. Then they re-experience things that they did in life, often in extraordinary detail, like knowing how their actions affected everyone they interacted with, and even how they affected people several steps removed from their own actions. They report that they feel profound shame when reliving the things that they did wrong, and they report that God didn't thunderously condemn them, but instead took a supporting and loving attitude as they experienced their own shame and learned their lesson. They thus reported that the experience felt like they were judging themselves rather than being condemned by God. Now, let's compare this to what we find in the Bible. It depicts God or Jesus in the role of a king, and God or Jesus condemns some people to hell, like a king passing sentence on a condemned criminal. But are these pictures irreconcilable, given the philosophical reflection that has occurred over the last 2,000 years, and the fact that the New Testament itself stresses the love of God, with 1 John 4:8 even declaring that God is love? We shouldn't expect God to act like an angry king in judging us. God loves us. The imagery of God as an angry king thus may have been to help the ancient audience understand the situation, but we may not expect that God will literally be an angry king with respect to the saved, the people who responded to his invitation of grace in Jesus Christ. I mean, after all, he loved them enough to die for them on the cross. And when we actually read parables like the sheep and the goats, Jesus does not condemn the saved for every little thing that they do. He says, enter the kingdom. In other parables where God, a figure representing God, casts some people out, he just welcomes other people without nitpicking them for every little thing. We thus need to understand the angry judge and king image as different than what the saved should actually expect to experience. So what should a saved person actually expect? I imagine that they would expect to be confronted with their deeds, both good and bad, and that they would feel shame regarding their bad deeds. That would feel like they're judging themselves. Meanwhile, since they're among the saved, they wouldn't feel that God was condemning them. Instead, they would feel like God was acknowledging their bad deeds while also supporting and loving them. I thus think that when you take into account the fact that God is love and that the God as judgmental king imagery needed to be understood in the context of the time, that we find what we find NDEs reporting actually corresponds a lot with what we'd expect. God is loving and supportive of the saved, but he recognizes also the evil that they did on earth. And the NDEers recognize this evil also. So they feel like the primary experience is like one of judging themselves, not feeling like an angry king was condemning them. I thus see what NDEers report and what the Bible contains as being compatible.
Then let's look at another question. What do you make of NDE reports that people reincarnate?
There are some NDE reports that mention reincarnation. The question is going to be whether these mentions are common enough that they form part of the core experience that we can trust or have more confidence in, or whether they are rare enough that they are anomalous outlier data that we can't have confidence in. For that, we need a sense of the threshold of what is needed for something to be part of the core experience. In 1983, researcher and medical doctor Bruce Grayson created a list of items that people commonly report in NDEs, like whether time seemed to speed up, did scenes from your past come back to you, did you see deceased people or religious figures. So you could count up the number of items that people experienced and how strongly they experienced them, and then assign a numerical value to how strong the person's experience ranked on this NDE scale. If it scored highly enough, then it was similar enough to known NDE characteristics to say that the person had an NDE rather than some other type of experience. The Grayson scale was revised based on updated data in 2020 by a team of researchers. The team was led by Charlotte Marshall, and Grayson was one of the contributors. The new scale, which is known as the NDEC scale for Near-Death Experience Content Scale, listed 20 items that form the core of the NDE experience based on current statistics. And just so you'll understand what the core of the experience is, here are those 20 items.
1. Time perception. Your perception of time was altered. 2. Speeded thoughts. Your thoughts speeded up. 3. Voice. You heard one or several voices which did not have any material incarnation. 4. Understanding. You had the feeling of suddenly understanding everything about yourself, the others, and or the universe. 5. Peacefulness and well-being. You had a feeling of peace and or well-being. 6. Harmony and unity. You felt a sense of harmony or unity, as if you belonged to a larger whole. 7. Bright light. You saw or felt surrounded by a bright light without any determined material origin. 8. Unusual sensation. You experienced unusual sensations, sight, hearing, smell, touch, and or taste. 9. Extrasensory perception. You were aware of things beyond what your senses can usually perceive. 10. Precognition. You gain insightful knowledge about the future. 11. Out-of-body experience. You had the impression of being outside of or separated from your own body. 12. Leaving the earthly world. You had the sensation of leaving the earthly world, or of entering a new dimension and or environment. 13. Life review. You saw or relived events from your past. 14. Encounter. You encountered a presence and or an entity who might be deceased. 15. Non-existence, void, or fear. You had a feeling of non-existence, of being in a total void, and or of fear. 16. Border or point of no return. You came close to a border and or point of no return. 17. Come back. You made the decision, or were forced, to come back from the experience. 18. Dying. You had the feeling of dying and or being dead. 19. Gateway. You saw or entered a gateway, for instance, a tunnel or a door. 20. Ineffability. You sense that the experience cannot be described adequately in words.
So those are the 20 items that recent statistical work has shown to be part of the core of near-death experiences. Not every NDE reports remembering having all 20 items happen to them, but these are the most common elements. And you can gauge the similarity of a person's experience to a classic NDE by totaling up how many of these elements they remember happening and how strongly they remember them happening. The paper announcing the revised scale also included pie charts indicating how many surveyed NDEers reported a phenomenon and how strong they felt the phenomenon was. For example, item 1 was time perception and whether a person felt that their perception of time was altered during the experience. 2% of respondents said that it was slightly altered, 7% said it was moderately altered, 9% said that it was strongly altered, and 62% said that it was extremely altered. Adding all that up, 80% of surveyed NDEers said that their perception of time was altered in some way, and only 20% said that they did not experience an alteration in the perception of time. This is one of the stronger characteristics of the experience based on the statistics, so this is definitely part of the core experience. By contrast, the weakest of the characteristics that was still strong enough to make the cut in this survey was item 15, which involved having a feeling of non-existence, of being in a total void, or of being afraid, which are characteristics often reported in distress in NDEs. Well, 70% of surveyed NDEers said that they didn't remember any feeling of these things, but 30% did in varying degrees. So that gives you a kind of sense of what level of survey response is needed for something to make the cut of being one of the core characteristics of an NDE. On this survey, if at least 30% of respondents reported a characteristic that they were asked about, then it made the cut. Now, you may have noticed that reincarnation is not mentioned in any of these 20 core common characteristics of NDEs. But that could be simply because the researchers didn't think to ask the NDEers about it. After all, the 20 characteristics are all phrased in very general terms, like item 3, which involved hearing one or more voices that didn't originate in a living person. Well, people got asked about whether they heard voices, but they didn't get asked what the voices said. So maybe one of the things the voices mentioned was that the NDEer would be reincarnated. We thus need further research on this, and so Miller decided to do that for his book. Back in 1998, a medical doctor and NDE researcher named Jeffrey Long started an organization called the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, or NDERF, and he and his wife run its website. One of the things they let you do is answer a questionnaire and upload an account of your NDE. So they've built a huge database of reported NDEs. Currently, they have more than 5,500, so this can be a really valuable source for doing statistical work. What Miller decided to do was take a random sample of the NDERF reports. He wanted a random sample of 100 plausible NDEs. The fact that it's a random sample is important because you can make it sound like NDEs report anything you want if you just cherry pick the ones that mention the things you like and then group them together, say in a book. To get his random sample, Miller started reading the NDERF reports at the beginning and kept going until he had 100 plausible NDEs. I say plausible NDEs because the NDERF website doesn't reject a lot of experiences. If someone reports something, they tend to just upload it, though the Longs do some analysis of probability as to whether an experience is likely an NDE. In the end, Miller ended up reading the first 141 NDEs, but he eliminated 41 of those because of red flags they contain. Miller explains,
"My culling of certain reported experiences was not arbitrary. I consulted, for example, the Parnia et al. Guidelines and Standards article to justify my choices. These authors use the term authentic NDEs. The Grayson scale has also been useful in determining if an experience is a true NDE. Thus, to choose my probably authentic 100 sample, I rejected cases with significant red flags, whether they supported or contradicted Christian doctrine if, for example, A. It's clearly admitted to not be an NDE. For example, some will say that they took LSD, so that it's likely a drug trip rather than an NDE. Others tell all the things they learned through repeated visions throughout life. One merely told the story of meeting his soulmate. Obviously, none of these should be considered NDEs. B. I see signs of hallucinations or mental illness. For example, one spoke of around 8 experiences with death scattered throughout life, living on the streets, seeing psychiatrists, etc. When people speak of multiple visions throughout life or messages from the other side on a regular basis, this can be a red flag for possible mental illness. C. The person advertises a book she is writing about the experience or is hawking her wares or services. This provides an ulterior motive for exaggeration to make things more dramatic, or to try to conform their experience to a target audience. I will accept all the remaining experiences reported near death in my report, even if they seem anomalous or to contradict my personal theology. Of course, a certain percentage of those remaining NDEs could be impacted by hallucinations, or mental illness, or demons, or whatever. But since I can't see signs of that in every case, I must include them in my tally.
So what did Miller discover about reincarnation once he had his 100 probable authentic NDEs?
He says,
In my study of 100 consecutive NDEs on the NDERF site, I counted the instances where reincarnation was taught by the experience. Recall that I had narrowed my field down to 100 after culling reports that were actually reports of vivid dreams or visions, not coming close to death, or had too many red flags to take seriously. I found only 2 such experiences, and even those 2 contained some red flags. Reincarnation NDE number 1. In this case, a man reported falling off a bed at age 2.5. In the resulting NDE, he saw many souls making their way to the end of the tunnel, one of which had completed all his lives and boasted with pride at his great accomplishment. I'd never seen anyone in an NDE boasting with pride, which I thought was quite uncharacteristic. Overwhelmingly, those with positive NDEs report feeling elated, loved, and humbly in awe of all they see and know and experience. He also reported the image of a golden castle, but it was dull and lifeless. I remember feeling pity for it, he said. Again, I've never seen a positive experience where the buildings and landscapes were not exceptionally beautiful. Also, the fact that he experienced it so young may cause some to question his accurate memory. These were 3 red flags calling into question whether all aspects of this NDE should be taken with authority. But for the sake of this study, let's accept this as one mention of reincarnation in an NDE. Reincarnation NDE number 2. A car wreck evoked this NDE. He said, all of the life here on earth was there that had been past and present, which to me explained the concepts of human reproduction and the feelings that some people get about reincarnation. This was to me the essence of human, animal, and even plant life. I'm not sure if by this he's stating that his experience actually taught reincarnation, or if he's merely stating that a part of his experience evoked feelings that might be similar to what people feel regarding reincarnation. Results. Although I have reservations about both of these experiences clearly teaching reincarnation, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and conclude that at most 2 of my 100 consecutive NDEs taught reincarnation. That means that of 100 consecutive NDEs, a full 98 said nothing about reincarnation. The anomalous 2% is nothing near a core element. Since we're expecting, even among NDEs with no red flags, that some might contain false memories, hallucinatory elements, exaggerations, elements from mental illness, demonic influence, etc., we simply can't take a detail that occurs in only 2% of NDEs and consider it a standard element. I'm not the only one to notice that the overwhelming majority of NDEs don't teach reincarnation. In Dr. Raymond Moody's groundbreaking 1975 book, Life After Life, he was pretty emphatic about his 100-plus cases. Not any of the cases I have looked into is in any way indicative to me that reincarnation occurs. On the other hand, he noted that this observation doesn't necessarily rule out reincarnation. He simply didn't find it supported in his cases. Cardiologist and longtime NDE researcher Michael Sabom told me with no reservations, NDEs don't teach reincarnation. Interestingly, a 2021 Pew survey of 6,485 U.S. adults found 33%, one-third, believing in reincarnation. The tiny percentage of NDE reincarnation reports is just another indication that NDE content isn't caused by our expectations of what will happen at death. If one-third of the population believes that the main event of our death is our reincarnation as either another human or an animal, and if expectations cause the content of NDEs, we'd expect about one-third to speak of something regarding reincarnation. Why would researchers find only 2% in my study, or none, Moody and Sabom?
So Miller found only 2% of the plausible NDEs he surveyed mentioned reincarnation, and even that 2% was questionable based on the red flags in the reports. Even if you grant the 2%, this would still be outlier data and not part of the core experience, but I know you, Jimmy, and you cross-examine everything, even if it's something that agrees with your own viewpoint. Can you think of any reason to doubt Miller's results?
I can think of two grounds on which to challenge his survey that I think have merit. First, 100 cases is a small sample size. I would much rather see a survey of 500 or 1,000 cases. That would give us greater assurance of it being representative. Second, despite the fact that the NDERF database is the most information-rich one that we have, it isn't going to be representative of the world population, and that applies especially to its earliest cases. Today, the website is available in multiple languages, but I suspect it's still better known in the English-speaking world than elsewhere. English speakers also have better internet access than people in some parts of the world, and I suspect the bias towards English was especially strong in the website's earliest days, back when they started collecting NDE reports in 1999, the year after they were founded, and so it's those early reports that Miller was focused on. Also, medical care is different in different parts of the world, and we tend to have better medicine in the English-speaking world than in the developing world, so not as many people may get to come back from clinical death in some parts of the world, and that could affect NDE reports. So despite the information richness of the database, I suspect that it's not fully representative of what people all over the world experience. Well, India is now the most populous country in the world, having surpassed China. Today, there are 1.4 billion Indians out of the global population of 8.2 billion, so that's about 17% of the world population that's Indian. People believe in reincarnation in India at a much higher rate than in the English-speaking world, although not as high a rate as you might think. So if the NDERF database had 17% of its reports from India rather than the lower percent it actually does, you might find a lot more mentions of reincarnation.
Do you think that these objections are fatal to Miller's conclusions about reincarnation?
I think that they're reason for concern. I'd like to see a study with a larger sample size. I'd like to see it based on a random sample of more recent reports, not just the first ones when the NDERF website was starting out. And I'd like to see it representative of the global population. I'm not criticizing Miller here. Time constraints dictated the sample size, and the fact that the NDERF database is the most information-rich resource we have made it a logical one to use. The only thing I'd do differently if I were conducting the study myself would be to use a random number generator to start at a random point in the second half of the database rather than starting at the beginning. I'd also use a larger sample size if I had time. But despite these concerns, I don't think that they invalidate Miller's conclusions. Other U.S.-based researchers like Moody and Sabam did not find reincarnation in the reports they've studied. And the key thing is that even here in the U.S., a large chunk of the population believes in reincarnation, 33% according to the 2021 Pew study. So that third of the population would expect reincarnation to be part of the afterlife. And even here in the U.S., you'd expect it to be mentioned in their NDE reports if the contents of NDEs were based on expectations that people have of the afterlife. Also, if the content of NDEs is not based on what a person expects, as seems to be the case, a third of the American population would not be put in any barrier in the way of reincarnation being reported in their NDEs. So if you find only a questionable 2% or an even lower figure here in the United States, that's a compelling reason to conclude that mentions of reincarnation in NDEs are outlier data that are not part of the core experience. I thus agree with Miller that based on the data we have, it really does not look like NDEs teach reincarnation.
Then let's turn to another objection. One issue you identified for us was the presence of religious figures in NDEs like God, Jesus, Buddha, and Muhammad. Do we find anything here that would cause problems for the Christian faith?
Well, there's no doubt that people see religious figures in NDEs. That's well established. The problem is that researchers don't usually devote a lot of attention to which religious figures they see. This may be due to an understandable desire to remain scientifically neutral with respect to religions. And whether researchers even ask about seeing religious figures is up to the researchers. For example, in the Revised Grayson Scale, they don't consider the religious figures question directly. Many NDEers report meeting a being of light that they recognize as God and that they have a conversation with and who often gives them their life review. But in the Revised Scale, they break this up under multiple categories. Item 3 is, did you hear voices? Item 7 is, did you see a bright light? And item 13 is, did you have a life review? But they don't have a category for, I saw a being of light who spoke to me and gave me a life review, much less a category for, I met God, I met Jesus, I met Buddha, or I met Muhammad. So what religious figures people see is a somewhat understudied issue.
One idea that I know has been proposed is that people may encounter a being of light and then interpret it in terms of their own beliefs or cultural background. So if someone who's a Christian or even an atheist from a historically Christian country, they may meet a being of light and interpret it as meeting Jesus. What can we say about that proposal?
Well, it's not impossible. I think it is possible that some people might meet a figure and then interpret it as someone they're familiar with, like Jesus. However, I don't think this is the case in all instances. A lot of reports we have don't just say that the person met a being of light and assumed or inferred that it was Jesus. They say that the person knew it was Jesus that they were meeting. And that's not surprising if they also recognize their relatives and loved ones, which they do. They'll say, my grandfather or my mother met me. Because this is a telepathic experience since you don't have your body with you. So you're identifying people based on information that's being transmitted mentally. So if you meet Jesus and make mental contact with him, then it's plausible that you will just know that it's Jesus. NDEers also distinguish Jesus from other figures. For example, they will say that they met God and they met Jesus. Or they will say that they met someone and the person they met was not Jesus, but had been sent by Jesus. So they're not confusing Jesus with other people willy-nilly.
How often does Jesus appear in NDEs?
Miller's study of 100 cases looked at that, and here's what he reports.
Out of the entire 141 consecutive cases on the NDERF site, 28 mentioned Jesus, which was 20% of the total, or 1 out of every 5 reports. I then called the cases that either were not true NDEs, for example, admitted to be hallucinogenic drug experiences, or were reported as visions or vivid dreams, or pursuing an out-of-body experience rather than being experienced near death, or had too many red flags, for example, showed signs of mental illness, contradicted themselves, or were trying to sell their books. The remaining 100 NDEs appear to be true NDEs. Out of 100 consecutive NDEs, 18%, or again approximately 1 out of 5, claim to see Jesus. I'll repeat that this was an unexpected finding. I had seen cases mentioning Jesus cited in NDE studies, but had assumed that they were such a small percentage as to be deemed anomalous to the main experience. But 18% and 20% puts the incidence of Jesus up there with such standard core NDE elements as seeing deceased persons, 13% according to Kelly, and having a life review, 17% in Grayson's sample, 22.2% in Long's study. And I'm not the first researcher to note this. A smaller pilot study by Jack Hiller of 62, compared to my 141 cases since he didn't mention culling any cases, of the most recent NDERF cases submitted globally, found 13% reporting encounters with Jesus, including a report of Jesus from the only self-described Jew in his sampling. In a study of 47 NDEers, Dr. Michael Sabom found 36% of conservative Christians and 31% of liberal Christians reporting seeing Jesus, or Lord.
So Miller and also Hiller found appearances of Jesus in NDEs to be quite frequent, so much so that by some measures, seeing Jesus could even be considered a core aspect of the experience.
Of course, that could all be due to a person's expectations if a person was a Christian or an atheist or agnostic from a historically Christian country. What about the appearances of non-Christian religious figures like Hindu deities, Buddha, or Muhammad?
Miller also looked at that. His initial survey of 100 plausible NDEs didn't contain enough members of other religions, so he did a series of follow-up studies in which he did whole database searches looking for key terms for other religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam.
Then let's look at what he found for each of those. What did he find regarding Hinduism?
The situation with Hindus is complicated by the fact that Hinduism is an extremely diverse religious movement. In fact, some scholars have suggested that the very term Hindu is misleading, and there are actually several different religions in India that Westerners have just grouped together under the common term Hinduism. It's also complicated by the fact that Hindu views of God are rather complicated. Although many people regard Hinduism as a polytheist religion that believes in multiple deities, research done by the Pew Corporation in 2019 and 2020 paints a different picture. According to their findings, only 7% of Hindus believe in actual, literal, multiple gods. Instead, 61% of Hindus say that there is actually only one God, but there are multiple forms he appears in. And 29% of Hindus just flatly say there is only one God. If you put that 61% and 29% together, that's 90%. So it turns out that the large majority of Hindus are actually monotheists. It's just that they use a variety of names or images for the one God. This means that if a Hindu encounters God as a being of light, they may use a Hindu name or image when they are understanding God, at least initially. Nonetheless, here's what Miller found when he searched the NDERF database.
Out of the total of 5,061 cases that the database had at the time of the study, only 3 claimed to have seen Krishna, which is less than 1 in 1,000. And 2 of those cases had red flags that made them questionable as authentic NDEs. None of the 3 simply said they saw a light and identified it with Krishna, as would have been expected by the each religion sees a light and interprets it as their own prophet/deities hypothesis. Instead, they simply said that they saw Krishna. But also note that in each of these 3 cases, they reported seeing multiple deities. In fact, all 3 reported seeing Jesus as well. Thus, I searched Hindu in the NDERF database and found a total of 100 instances. Most of these were making comments about Hindus or Hindu teachings, but were not claiming to be Hindus. Of the remaining cases, I dismissed the ones that were not actually NDEs, for example, had a dream or vision or drug trip unrelated to death. Of the remaining reports, 33 either identified as Hindu or grew up with at least one Hindu parent. Only 2 of the 33 clearly say that they experienced a Hindu god, but neither of them reported recognizing the god visually, as if it looked like the unique statues or paintings of the god. Rather, they spoke of feeling the presence of God, identifying it as what they took to be the supreme god in their particular brand of Hinduism. Thus, these 2 appeared to be cases of a person experiencing God on the other side and calling him by the name they knew him by. This would seem equivalent to one Christian calling him God and another Lord and another Jehovah, or a Muslim experiencing God and calling him Allah. Thus, 2 out of 30, 7%, note seeing a Hindu god, each of which refer to their supreme god. This would in no way throw doubt on the real Jesus hypothesis, since the percentage is so small as to be anomalous. 2 of 30 is 7%, far from being a core element for Hindus. And since those 2 seem to be merely feeling the presence of God, not seeing a specific form of God, in order to be able to say it was their God as distinguished from Jehovah, and calling him by the name of the highest God in their religious system.
So it looks like, at least given the limited number of reports from Hindus available, that seeing distinctly Hindu deities is anomalous rather than a core part of the experience. And those Hindus who did see God may have simply been calling him by a term that was used in their culture for the one God.
Then what about Buddhism? What did Miller discover about it?
He states,
I searched all occurrences for Buddha in the NDEs database and found 29 cases. Of these, the vast majority were only speaking of some aspect of Buddhist teachings rather than reporting actually seeing a living Buddha on the other side. Of over 5,000 NDEs reported in the NDEs database, I couldn't find one clear report of a living Buddha in an otherwise typical, not anomalous, NDE. I found 26 occurrences of the word Buddhist in the NDEs database. Of these, only 6 claim that at the time of their experience they were either Buddhist, leaning primarily Buddhist, or had at least one Buddhist parent. None of them spoke of seeing Buddha in their NDEs, or spoke of seeing any niche Buddhist gods or niche Buddhist beings. Interestingly, one man, whose mother was a practicing Buddhist, was instructed by God in his NDE to go to church, although he had never gone to church and was very opposed to Christian churches. Eventually, he started attending, became a believing Christian, and began impacting others for Jesus.
So again, nothing here suggesting that Buddhists see distinctly Buddhist religious figures in their NDEs, and nothing to conflict with Christianity.
Then what about Islam? What did Miller find on it?
Before we get to that, it's worth noting an initial point that Miller makes.
Muslims are urged to say the Shahada when near death. There is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet, and to say it to those who are dying. This would make Muhammad a top-of-mind thought before death. If top-of-mind thoughts sometimes influence NDE content, as some naturalists might suggest, then this practice might cause more Muhammad sightings for Muslims than Jesus sightings for Christians, since Christian doctrine nowhere directs us to repeat a religious creed on our deathbeds. If, rather than finding a small, anomalous percentage of Muslims reporting Muhammad, we find something approaching the 1 in 5 Jesus sightings, then this might support the false identity hypothesis of Jesus appearances.
So with that in mind, here is what Miller actually found.
I searched the NDEs website and found 80 cases in which people either self-identified as Muslim or noted that they were from majority Muslim countries. None of them mentioned seeing Muhammad. Then I searched Muhammad in the entire 5,000 plus experiences currently reported in this database. Again, none stated with assurance that they saw Muhammad. Only one stated, with hesitancy, in response to the NDEs question about seeing religious figures, "Uncertain. I saw a light which I believe may have been Muhammad." Had 1 in 5 in the NDEs collection claimed to see Muhammad, as 1 in 5 of my consecutive 100 NDEs cases claim to see Jesus, I'd have expected to find 1,000 sightings of Muhammad. Those who assume that Christians see Jesus and Muslims see Muhammad would expect at least 16 out of 80 Muslims claiming to have seen Muhammad. Surely, if we find scattered sightings of Muhammad on the internet or in books, we should put them in the anomalous category, unless we find a large incidence from a random sample.
So once more, Miller's findings do not support the thesis that Muslims would see Muhammad.
I understand that Miller also did one more study as a kind of control case. What did that involve?
It involved searching the database looking for mentions of aliens in NDEs because it's always aliens. Miller reports,
Sure enough, I searched the NDERF site and found 15 cases claiming to either see aliens or learn about aliens or see beings that look like aliens. This came to 6 out of 1,000, 0.6%, which is less than 1%. So, do aliens exist? Have people truly encountered them in NDEs? Based solely upon the present study, I can't give a definitive answer. I can only say that they are reported so infrequently that I can't say that NDEs support the existence of aliens. They appear far too infrequently to be considered a part of the core experience. After all, we can't believe every report, since some people have false memories. Some have hallucinations that look similar to NDEs, some have mental issues, etc. Similarly, I found even less reports of Buddha, Krishna, or Muhammad. Surely we should put them in the same anomalous category with aliens. I'm not concluding from these studies that they are all fictitious or irrelevant to religious experience. I'm merely saying that at this point in NDE research, their reports and NDEs are so small that NDEs shouldn't be cited as evidence for their reality on the other side.
So, what can we say about Miller's findings regarding religious figures in general?
well, we need more data than we presently have. We need reports of NDEs from a more representative sample of people of all religions. However, given the data that we do have, seeing God in NDEs, regardless of the name he's called by, is quite common. So is seeing Jesus, with Jesus being a distinct figure from God. Seeing Jesus is so common that it can even be considered one of the core elements of NDEs. I would also note that Jesus is seen by people who aren't Christian, including atheists, Jewish people, and, as we heard, some Hindus. By contrast, seeing figures from any other religion, like Buddha or Muhammad, is so infrequent on a percentage basis that such reports presently fall into the category of outlier data. Even reports of seeing aliens, which are also outlier data, are more common than seeing Muhammad, Krishna, or Buddha. It thus appears that at present, the idea that people see religious figures based on their personal or cultural expectations about the afterlife is not established. And from a religious perspective, the data we have available actually favors Christianity rather than threatening it.
Then let's look at the last issue you identified. Even if NDEs don't promote false teachings, they could still weaken people's faith in Christianity, like encouraging them to become spiritual rather than religious. What does the data say about that?
Here, Miller reports a helpful summary of what several researchers have found, both regarding the effects of NDEs on those who have them and on the physicians who care for them.
Cardiologist Michael Sabom conducted such a study. Here's how it began. According to media reports, near-death experiencers and researchers agreed that NDEs drew persons away from organized religion and toward a more abstract spirituality. But my observation from my own patients was exactly the opposite. NDEs seemed to produce a stronger faith and a higher level of commitment to traditional religious practice. Since much of the religious controversy surrounding the NDE hinged on this point, I was struck by this apparent contradiction. Although Dr. Sabom never had his own NDE, his original study of NDEs in his patients led him to a much deeper faith. My walk with the Lord has deepened, and I have benefited from the teaching and encouragement of several Christian leaders in the Atlanta area. In 1993, I joined the Presbyterian Church of America, a conservative Christian denomination, and was ordained an elder shortly before writing this book. Thus, Dr. Sabom claims to be an exception to the claim that studying NDEs leads to nothing but confusion, bad doctrine, etc. Could Sabom's spiritual journey be quite common among NDEers? To test this hypothesis, Sabom conducted the Atlanta study. He interviewed his patients who experienced NDEs to see if they typically moved away from traditional Christianity to, for example, New Age beliefs. They didn't. He concluded that a belief in reincarnation and an Eastern Universalist religion is not a direct after-effect of near-death experience. Instead, his NDE patients took traditional church involvement more seriously. An NDE appears to significantly bolster one's intrinsic faith, meaning in life, capacity for love, and involvement in family. NDEs lead to a strengthened belief in God, belief in life after death, and enhanced biblical traits and works such as concern for others, the desire to pray, and decreased one's emphasis on the material world. But even if NDEers stick with Christianity, don't they have a tendency to move toward a more liberal form of Christianity that may deny the teachings of and atoning work of Jesus? Not according to Sabom's study. Of 4 NDEers who made changes in their Christian belief system, all changed to a more conservative Christian doctrine. Dr. Penny Sartori, in her dissertation on NDEs in a UK hospital, found all patients reported an increased tendency to pray, go to church, and read the Bible. Ditto psychiatrist George Ritchie. Before his near-death experience, he was not religious. After it, he believed in Jesus absolutely, began reading his Bible, forgiving, loving, and letting go of his self-righteousness. Dr. Diane M. Comp, the Yale pediatric oncologist, after observing her patients' DBEs, was transformed from atheism and existentialism into a believer in God and follower of Jesus. Cardiologist Maurice Rawlings' conversion to an authentic Christian faith began when he witnessed his patient experiencing a hellish NDE during cardiac arrest and multiple resuscitations. His further NDE and DBE investigations and spiritual seeking led him to trust the Bible and accept Jesus as Lord.
So, based on both Michael Sabom's Atlanta study and on the observations of other researchers, including the effects on their own lives, NDEs did not have a tendency to move people towards a more abstract set of religious views, but towards a more conservative religiosity.
So, Jimmy, what's your bottom line on this topic?
You may often hear things in the press like NDEs teach reincarnation, that people see whatever religious figures they or their culture believe in, and that they encourage people towards a new age, spiritual but not religious viewpoint. However, the data we have at hand indicates that all of these claims are not true. If we focus on the core experience of NDEs rather than outlier claims that could be mistaken for any number of reasons, including hoaxing and bad memory, it turns out that NDEs do not support the idea that we reincarnate. They do not involve whatever religious figure a person or their culture believes in. Instead, they involve what looks like a monotheistic understanding of God, and they focus in particular on the figure of Jesus Christ, so much so that seeing Jesus could be considered a core part of the experience. And far from encouraging a vague spirituality, they actually seem to move people in a more conservative religious direction. I thus conclude that based on the data at hand, since science is always provisional, NDEs do not threaten but actually seem supportive of Christianity, and we have no evidence favoring the demon hypothesis as a general explanation for NDEs.
Jimmy, what further resources can we offer to the listeners and viewers?
We'll have links to J. Steve Miller's book, Is Christianity Compatible with Deathbed and Near-Death Experiences?, Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, Gregory Shushan's book, Near-Death Experiences in Indigenous Religions, Bruce Grayson's paper, Near-Death Experiences and Attempted Suicide, Bruce Grayson's original 1983 paper, Introducing the Grayson Scale, and Charlotte Marshall and others' paper, Near-Death Experience Content, the Near-Death Experience Content Scale, development, and psychometric validation. Also, Pew Research on Hinduism that I mentioned.
Very good. So before we go, we actually do have some mysterious feedback we'd like to share from some of our previous episodes.
Yeah, and I want to mention, so this is the return of mysterious feedback. We haven't had it in quite a while. We had an experiment where we were trying to do exclusively feedback episodes, but then my schedule altered in a way that made that impractical. But I really like feedback, and whether it's positive or negative, I really like getting it. I really like covering it and involving the listeners in the show in that way. And so our feedback coordinator, Rob, and we had a conversation about how we could best do this. And so we're going to be trying to include a small amount of feedback at the end of the episodes, just like we did in the early days.
Yes, excellent. So I'm glad to have this back. So our first bit of feedback comes from our recent episode 355 on UFO observables. And Paul on Facebook wrote, "There should be much more discussion of potential camera artifacts and the psychological effects of what happens when you think you see something scary. When using Occam's razor, the work of Mick West seems much more likely to me. All of the conjecture about the potential technologies that could satisfy the observables feels a bit silly when, in my opinion, they really haven't ruled out camera effects, misperceptions, and artifacts in the recording devices."
Well, Paul, I'm a big believer in focusing attention on camera artifacts. This is one of the things that crops up regularly in paranormal studies where you have people who see things on film and think, oh, this little blotch is a ghost or something. And no, it's a purely natural camera artifact. It's like a lens flare, or it's a reflection, or it's a bug that's out of focus. And there's a whole literature devoted to orbs appear in cameras, and they're basically all camera artifacts. So I'm definitely with you, but with the imagery that has been acquired regarding UAPs or UFOs, it's some of it could be dismissed as camera artifacts, but a lot of it can't. And also bear in mind that unfortunately they haven't declassified it, but they apparently have much higher resolution versions of this footage that they're not releasing because they don't want our competitor nation states to know how good our resolution actually is. So I'm sympathetic to the purpose, and I think it definitely applies in some areas, but I wouldn't just dismiss what is being reported in the UFO area.
If I could add, some of the stuff I've seen, like of the jellyfish phenomena and some of the other UAPs, they may be hoaxes, they may be misperception, helium balloons or something, but they're not camera artifacts, that's for sure.
Yeah. So
yeah, that would be, I would agree with that. Our next feedback comes from Mattress Dog on our Discord server. He joined the community there. Gentle nitpick about episode 355. Flaps are not control surfaces on aircraft and do not affect maneuverability on standard aircraft. They serve a different function entirely. I think Jimmy meant ailerons. I wouldn't be mentioning this, but he makes the mistake a few times, and as a pilot, it hurt just a little. Owie.
I'm sorry about that, Mattress Dog, and I appreciate the correction.
And then we have some fan art that I want to share. This comes from Mikel Sampaio. Sorry, Mikel, if I mispronounced that. That's a name I haven't seen before. It's a beautiful name. He says, "My 10-year-old son, Miguel, and I are big fans of your podcast." Or
maybe she.
I'm sorry. I made an assumption that it could be she. "My 10-year-old son, Miguel, and I are big fans of your podcast, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Great job. Miguel is also a big fan of Legos, and he decided to create you and Dom with Lego pieces, including some aliens, because, it's always aliens. I hope you enjoy this little art creation. P.S. The alien stole your cowboy hat, and the black droid refers to Dom being on the Secrets of Star Wars podcast." Yeah.
And we have several pictures that Michael sent in from his or her son, Miguel, and they look really cool. So yes. Good job, Miguel, and thank you so much for doing the artwork and sharing it with us.
If you watch the video, you have seen it on screen, but I'll also link them on the show notes for this episode for the folks who listen to the audio form of the podcast. Excellent. And thank you, everyone, for your feedback. We really do appreciate it, and we look forward to getting more of your feedback on future episodes. And with that, it is time to hear from you. What are your theories about Christianity, near-death experiences, and deathbed visions? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515. And I do want to, again, thank our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. Check it out by going to youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. While you're there, you can help me out by liking, commenting, writing a review, and sharing the podcast with other people. Also, I'm trying to get up to 100,000 subscribers on YouTube, and at the time of recording, we're almost there. So I'd love to have you as a subscriber. And be sure and hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video.
And I'd like to thank Craig Hart for his voiceover work in today's episode. So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to do another episode in our Lost Scripture series, which focuses on books that some people have thought or think should be Scripture, but that aren't in the Catholic Bible. This time, we're going to be looking at the book of 1 Esdras, which is considered by many in the Orthodox world to be canonical.
Folks, be sure to share the podcast with your friends and write a review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can give a star rating or wherever you get your podcast from. That helps us grow this community and reach more listeners. It's a very important way to juice the algorithm and get the show out there in front of more people. Be sure to get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/363. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at gradygroupinc.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.